Hi, welcome to session 2 of the first topic of the semester titled The Idea of Progress in the Making of Modern America. We're looking at the late 19th century, and particularly we're going to be looking at one of the most important ideas of this time that was like the spirit of the age, so to speak. Okay, the spirit of the age, or the most sacred idea in the United States, and that really influenced the way people considered, for example, the meaning of life in general. What was the purpose of human existence? How life originated? What are we doing here? Where are we going? You know, what does it be to be human, etc. How to build a society, for example, how to build an economic system or political system. Progress, again, was central in the way Americans were thinking about, again, life in general and how to really build a world. So this is essential. Again, for the rest of the semester, we're going to be dealing with this new age that is dawning in the late 19th century, the age of modernity. This is the building of modern America that simply has been expanding and has been progressing on many levels again across the 20th century and into the 21st century in a way that, again, that we're just simply building upon the ideas of the late 19th century, the ideas of progress. Again, they're still, again, in our culture, in our thinking, in our education system, and in our values in general as a society. The idea that we're supposed to be progressing in this world and building a better future, and so on. So let us then move forward with our discussion of the idea of progress by continuing to look at science and technology, the scientific and technological revolution of the 1800s. Particularly, we're going to be looking now, the late 1800s, and we're going to proceed then from where we actually stopped in the first session. I was actually elaborating upon the scientific revolution, the coming of a new science. The science of Isaac Newton, it's a very materialistic way of understanding the world and how it works in a very mechanical fashion. That there's a mechanism or a law that makes the world works, because that's the way, according to Newton, again, God actually made the universe. And is material, by the way. So the laws of nature are not really moved by any spirits. They're just simply, again, mechanical laws that are caused or moved by physical forces, just matter itself. Okay, matter is just, again, programmed to behave in a specific way, and all scientists can do is to just discover those laws. Again, that's according to Newton, and according to our science. I mean, this is the science of today that was born with Newton, is that all we can do is simply discover those laws. That's the role of the science. The scientific method is just you have to observe the natural world, the material world, gather facts from observation, and if you get the same result over and over again, then you have arrived to, the understanding of the law or several laws of nature. That's what we're supposed to be doing here, according to this new science. And of course, it really displaced the old science. The science of old was discarded based on spiritual forces. In the past, people used religious explanations, again, for how the world worked. And all of those explanations, according to the new science, were not valid, because the new scientists, again, of the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, all the way to today, cannot measure non-material entities. They cannot see them, they cannot measure them, and they cannot weigh it. So if they cannot grasp it with their five senses in a material sense, they're not really studying that. They're not taking those forces into account. In other words, when it comes to really how the world works, so they're only taking into account what they can see. In other words, with their senses, what they can measure, etc. Matter, that is. So it's a very materialistic, again, understanding of the universe, and this had a profound effect in the way that science is going to influence the way people see reality again. And it's called secularism again. That we're moving towards a secular society, meaning that society is more geared towards matter, the here and the now. This material, physical existence, people consider it to be real, important, and people are trying to take care of it and make a better world. In other words. Okay, because that's what science tells us, again, that reality is material. Okay, so at any rate, so we move forward to look at the technological revolution, and this, again, is essential to look at the arrival of modern technology, because what this new science did is that as thousands of scientists went out into the field to gather knowledge from observations as to what it was matter like, the elements, the chemicals, the forces. They used this knowledge in order to create new tools. Okay, so all the knowledge that the new scientists were gathering was used to create new technologies. And again, this is going to lead to a technological revolution, a revolution in tool making, in the knowledge of tool making. Okay, it came hand in hand with the scientific revolution, by the way. So it is really in the 19th century when we're going to see really the advent of modern technology. There's, without a doubt. I mean, this is the century where when many of the modern tools, the tools of modern life that we are so dependent upon in our world today, many of them were born there in that century, in that time. And what has been happening is that ever since the invention of those tools, all scientists have been doing is really just making them better, improving them, making those tools more and more advanced, more sophisticated. But they were, for the first time, introduced to humanity in the 19th century. This is the first time that human beings came across, again, many of the things that we take so much for granted. This is exactly what we're going to be looking at here, again, in the technological revolution, looking at what specific tools came about in the 19th century that revolutionized technology, in other words, and just created a whole new era. This high-tech civilization I announced in the very introduction, again, in session one, the high-tech industrial civilization, again, this high-tech civilization that we still live in, and that we project ourselves into the future, again, to be far more advanced than us, So at any rate, so let us look at the waves of those technological innovations, inventions of the 19th century that gave birth to the tools of modern life that are going to be part of this technological revolution. So, number one, we start with the most important technological innovation that really transformed human civilization, again, as it was back in the 19th century and prior. Okay, forever, it will never be the same, and that is electricity. This, again, even today, this is considered to be the lifeblood of our society and civilization, again, in the planet, because it really, again, this is the force that makes everything move. It makes everything work. Without electricity, just imagine for a second to be without electricity. I mean, we will be thrown back many centuries, into the past, to the way people lived, let's say, in the 1700s or 1600s, etc. Imagine. where there was no electricity back then. So therefore, uh, everything had to be done during the day. There was no nightlife. Just to start off, this idea of night work or nightlife was just very difficult because there was no artificial lighting, for example. Uh, People went to sleep very early. People used candles at home to light up their homes at night, or oil lamps for that matter. Uh, People gather wood, to take a hot bath. There were no electrical, for example, devices or boilers of any kind or stoves. People had to use wood to cook. You name it. So life, was very different, without electricity, as it became after the arrival of electricity, just so radically different. So it had a profound effect in the way people live. This is not just an invention. Again, this is really, once again, this is the lifeblood of our civilization today. It makes everything move, everything work. It makes our gadgets work, appliances, factories, offices. Everything is powered up with electricity. Electricity, of course, people knew about that. It's not that for the first time people discovered electricity in the 19th century. People, there were scientists in previous centuries that were already, kind of delving into this force that was very manifest in nature. Okay, people experience electricity in the world of nature in the form of lightning. Again, this is a natural electrical charge. What we call electromagnetism. It is a force of nature. It's a natural force. It's one of the forces of nature. Electromagnetism. Okay. So there's always been a fascination, by the way, about electricity for literally since the dawn of humanity. Not that early humans were inquiring about electricity in a scientific way. That's not what I'm suggesting here. It's just that um, th- there was a fascination, a mystery. Early humans actually turned lightning into a god. One of the first gods that humans prayed to in the very dawn of humanity, since the dawn of humanity, was lightning. Okay, because it was an awesome force. It was unfathomable. It was just so. Uh, it was a source of fear, a source of awe. People were in awe again at this natural display of power. That how lightning could just burn up an entire tree instantaneously or melt rocks, etc. It was just for early humans, it was terrifying, but they were also fascinated simultaneously. There was a fascination about that. Uh, but it is not until the 16 and 1700s where we're going to see Europeans and even some uh, American scientists looking into, of course, electromagnetism, particularly how to generate it. Okay, how to actually mimic, imitate what was happening in nature, and just wondering if there was the possibility of actually generating electricity. Imagine the possibilities. People will say, imagine what you can do with it. If somebody can actually generate electricity, they'll have at their disposal, the power of creation, they said, and the power of destruction. Okay, so there was, that kind of fascination again. Lightning or electromagnetism inspired among scientists, by the way. Okay. And there was also because of the contact with Chinese culture, Europeans were already trading, with the Chinese, and there's a lot of ideas, coming back and forth between China and Europe. The Chinese also introduced among the Europeans the understanding that human beings, of course, are also powered by electricity as well. That we have like an energy field, an energy grid, in other words, which was identical to the energy found in nature in terms of lightning. It was much, of course, of less powerful, but we were equally, of course, filled with energy as well. Okay, so this today you can see that, for example, when in hospitals people are trying to bring back to life somebody that has just died or is dying, and one of the first things that they do to resuscitate again that individual is, of course, run electrical shocks on the people's chest. Of course, electrical electricity. It will bring the heart back and stimulate it or fill it with energy, etc. So again, it's the relationship is already there, even in our world today. Or the story of Frankenstein, you can see that it was actually again written back in the late 1700s. How Frankenstein was created. Finally, when it was all assembled, the monster, the Frankenstein, the monster, it was pieced together by many body parts. It was finally brought to light with lightning as well. Lightning brings everything alive. Everything comes to life with electricity. Everything moves with electricity. Everything that is dead or inanimate can become animate. It can become alive. So again, this is very important. How people were thinking at this time in terms of electricity, the search for the mystery again of this awesome force. So it is not until 1822 when a Swedish scientist from Sweden by the name of Hans Christian Ørsted, he is going to be the one that finally came up with a device that generated electricity. The electrical generator, in other words. So for the first time in human history, people are now have discovered the way how to generate electricity. In other words, the electrical generator. And this is going to be, an invention that brought electricity itself to humanity, because now you can generate this force, you can transport it along cables. And with that, we're going to see that electricity is going to be used particularly in factories, particularly in industries, in order to power up motors, electrical motors. So we're going to see also, again, the invention of motors that are going to be used to move the machines that were used in the factories for the production of shoes, for the production of clothing, for the production of steel and so on. Again, people are going to be using now electrical motors in order to produce, again, the consumer products or the industrial products, again, that the industries back in Europe or in the United States were manufacturing. So this is going to accelerate, okay, the pace of work. The amount of products that you can actually produce is going to be maximized, because now you can add a force. Electricity is going to power up the electrical motors that are going to be moving the machines. And again, you got, more productivity. So it revolutionized industry. That's just to start, electricity itself. And it is in 1879 when there's going to be another gadget invented that was also powered by electricity, that also revolutionized the way people live and work, and that is the light bulb. Thomas Edison was the inventor of the light bulb in 1879, and with that we got now artificial lightning, okay, which is really trapped lightning. That's what it is. You freeze or trap just a small particle of that lightning, that flash of electricity we see outside in nature, and you freeze it, you trap it in a light bulb, and with that you can illuminate, of course, a room, an office, or a factory, and this is going to bring nightlife. Humans are now going to have more activity. Human activity is going to be extended at night. So instead of just going to sleep early around 7 or 8, etc., as it was the tradition before electricity and the light bulb. Now people are going to be extending their activity at night for studying, for doing work, for socializing. Okay, the possibilities are endless. Offices are going to be now powered with electricity, so workers, employees can have additional time to work. In the factories as well, we're going to see the introduction of night shifts as well, so production can continue, at night as well. There's more work to be done, and so on. In nightlife in general, for example, you're gonna bring light to the streets, so people can take a walk in the streets, or they can be at the park, for example. There are gonna be parks in the cities that are gonna be also illuminated with street lights and the like. Again, so this is going to change, the way people are living, working, socializing, and the like. Again, electricity itself, and this is going to be the most essential tool of modern life. Electricity, without it, once again, you cannot have a modern economy or society anywhere in the world. Any society that does not have electricity, from our point of view, okay, from our standards, they're undeveloped. Okay, they're in many cases, the bias or the prejudice is to call them, like things like backward or primitive, in other words, even though that's not the case. But from our standpoint, if you don't have electricity, where are you at? In other words, what are you doing? You're missing everything, So again, this is very important. Something born in the 19th century. The second tool of modern life is modern transportation systems. What we call modern transportation systems today, of course, are far more advanced than those that came in the 19th century. There's no doubt about that. But this is when the idea came into being, again, that you can move faster and easier, not only people, but goods, resources across vast spans of space. Okay? Large loads of cargo, for example, can be transported from point A to point B, or around the world, period. Again. So in the 19th century, we're going to see, particularly in the U.S., of course, the coming of the railroad. There's going to be a railroad revolution, by the way. Okay, railroad development starting in the 1830s. Okay, it started very slow, very gradually in the north part of the country, in Pennsylvania. Okay, it started extending, the railroad across New England, New York, and eventually into the Midwest. But after the Civil War and Reconstruction, we're going to see a railroad revolution extending all over the country, south, west, etc. All the territories, all the states are going to be interconnected again. And so, the railroad was instrumental. This technological revolution was instrumental because this transportation system that was far more advanced than anything that could transport people in the past, which people use animals, by the way. People in the past used animal muscle, animal power. What it did is that the railroad allowed for the emergence of nation states, not only in the United States, but wherever the railroad went. What it did is that it brought many of the provinces, many of the regions of a nation that were very separated and fragmented, it brought them together. Okay? It allowed for the rise of nations, in other words. Nations that were born, that were having enormous trouble, really unifying people, unifying communities, or unifying the states that were totally separated. The railroad pretty much unified, again, those societies, like American society was unified. It brought together the North, the South, and the West, in other words. All of those regions, it really brought them together. So it was easier for people to identify themselves as Americans because they could just move from state to state. They could travel around the country, relocate or invest in different parts of the country, visit, etc. So people gained the sense that they were Americans because instead of just living in your state and totally isolated and cut off from the rest of the country, the railroad allowed for the movement of people very rapidly, and so that really connected, accelerated the interconnectedness and the relationships again that people had with the nation, that they were part of the same nation, that they lived in the same country, and it was easier to build that identity, this national identity, in other words. Okay. Now, of course, cities, this is something that we're going to talk of course, much later once we go into the second topic. Some cities began to develop also systems of transportation within cities using the same technology, the railroad, but in this case, it was more like a sort of city type of railroad called the metro rail as well. Okay, so American cities are going to develop the metro rail. Again, people move in the metro to go to work, go shopping, etc. And again, this is another very important tool that came about in the late 19th century that began to change the way people live as well. Okay, and develop this idea of a national identity, that we're all part of the same nation state, that we're all Americans, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, the third tool of modern life that came in the 19th century was communication systems. Okay, communication systems. Just as there was a desire to create technologies to move people, to move resources across different regions and so on, so people can move food or travel or invest, etc., which brought the railroad. There was also the desire to create technology that will enable human beings to communicate with each other across vast spans of space faster and easier and more efficiently. To communicate, in this case, as fast as possible, if why not to communicate instantaneously. If somebody is living in the East Coast, they desire to communicate with people that were living in the Midwest, or they were living in the West Coast. Why not instantaneously? So it is in the 19th century that scientists, remember, there's a scientific revolution, so some scientists are going to inquire into that kind of area of communication, and they're going to come up with, again, devices that connected people, so they could communicate with each other faster than ever. And of course, it is in the 1840s that the telegraph came about, okay, with the scientist Samuel Morse. We're going to see the coming of the telegraph. What it is just, again, taking the principle of electricity. Electricity really travels in two wires. One is positive and the other one negative. It's just very basic, That's how electricity is transported, of course, across copper wires. And so the principle here is that you're going to use some electrical wires and put a gadget on both ends, on each end, and use like on and off, kind of like a switch that is really going on and off in certain sequences, okay, that depending on the number of beeps, okay, it actually sends a beep, if you will. Depending on the number of beeps, that will be a letter, okay? So, of course, every letter of the alphabet is going to contain a number of beeps, in other words. There's going to be a code, and it's called, again, the Morse code. In this case, the Morse code, after Samuel Morse, of course. The Morse code is simply a numerical value for each letter of the alphabet. And that will allow that person that is on the telegraph to actually decode, what somebody is actually saying to you. Let's say from outer state, somebody is sending you a message, and that person will have to pretty much identify, how many beeps that person is sending to pretty much put that into words, and they can be, again, very short messages that you can send. It sounds so, simplistic from our standpoint, because today we just use the internet. We can stream, we can use Zoom or whatever, we can see each other on the screen, etc. We communicate instantaneously more effectively today, but this idea started out back then. Okay, the desire to communicate instantaneously with, again, the telegraph. And so, again, this is the kind of like the beginning stages of the information age. Okay, and also in the 1870s, there was another scientist by the name of Alexander Graham Bell, who desired also to come up with a gadget to enable human beings to communicate directly, by means of actually talking to each other by using a microphone and a speaker, on both ends of the cables, that is to say. So instead of sending beeps that had to be interpreted and decoded, well, why not just talk to each other, hear each other, and so on. So again, he invented the telephone, which is really, again, all it is. It's just a little microphone and a speaker, and that's what it is, again. So it was invented in the 1870s, and telephone was born. And so one thing I want to mention here is that, despite the fact that this is just, for us, it's just so... it's not even vintage or retro. This is just, ancient history, when it comes to, our technology. The people living in this time have never experienced this ever in their lives. Ever. Okay? So this is the first time people confronted this kind of tool that was very magical. So that's exactly what they believed those technologies to be, magical works. They were bordering on magic. In other words, they believed that the scientists had really arrived to a scientific system, that they believed that scientific system was the correct one, because the proof of that is that they were now creating miracles. So how is it that they created a telephone? You can hear somebody else from 1,000 miles away. It's just, how is it that the voice traveled through the cables? It's just, unimaginable, incomprehensible. So for the untrained mind, for those that are not scientists, this is magic. It's almost like witchcraft. Something like that. So, but it was just science. It was an understanding of how the forces of nature work, and they were simply using that understanding to create gadgets, to create tools, in other words. So again, the impact was not, that people took for granted what, was going on, but rather there was a fascination about that. So therefore, of course, technological progress is considered to be real for people, and they want more progress. They, desire that every year those gadgets are improved and they're better, and that we're going to be moving to, a high-tech world in the future, of course, because what they said is that science was delivering. In other words, look, they're delivering now, okay? We can see it. But one of the consequences or byproducts of this revolution in communication systems was that the communication systems, again, of the telegraph and the telephone, what it did is that it really brought a new age, the age of information. Okay, it really ushered the information age that today is just accelerating at at the speed of light. In other words, because with the internet, with satellites and so on, yes, of course, it's just instantaneously that we can communicate with somebody at the other end of the world. Messages, information can be shared. Everything travels instantaneously. News travel instantaneously. The world knows what's going on around the world because there's access to that, communication system. There's a technology that allows for the transfer of ideas and messages, news, etc., at lightning speed. So what this is going to do to the human mind, okay, is that beginning around this time all the way to today, is that the people that are actually part of the information age, the people that have the gadgets, in other words, that are communicating messages or keeping up with news and so on, what is really, again, taking place is that people are gaining the sense that that the mind, again, is really, the mind of those people that are plugged in, if you will, to modern technology, particularly things like the telephone, the internet today, etc., is that there's a sense that time is accelerating, the quickening of time. And why is this so? Is because people who are in constant contact with information, that are receiving and sending information, what they're doing is that they're loading up the mind with so much data. And so as the mind is overwhelmed with information, the mind begins to process that data, that information, and it begins to think too much. So we're spending too much time in our minds, in other words, because there's just so much information that we're thinking about the world, etc. We spend so much time in our minds, and the more that we think, and the faster that our thoughts, cross, the screen of our consciousness, if you will. Okay, there's like a cascade of thoughts that are just taking place, a chattering, if you will, that is taking place so much in our minds. We perceive that this is really accelerating time. In other words, we think that time is going faster and faster and faster, but that's not the case. What is really going faster is the mind. The mind is the one that is thinking faster because it has so much information, so many thoughts, and we think that that's time. When in reality, again, as the science of today tells us, is that there is no time, of course. Okay, time only exists in our minds. And so, again, this is very important, that how people in the modern world that are so connected, so plugged in again to the information systems, have that kind of perception about time, that they're running out of time, that they have, the sense that time is just traveling so fast and so on. Okay, so again, I just want to, kind of delve into those meanings and perceptions, because this is something that even today people pretty much report in our world. This is one of the effects of technology upon us. In other words, how it alters the way we think and how we sense the world. All right, so number 4, the fourth tool of modern life is what is called chemistry, which in the ancient world, again, this the field of inquiry that dealt with molecules and chemicals was simply called alchemy. Okay, alchemy. In fact, the word chemistry comes from the word alchemy. Okay, and the alchemists of old were actually people considered to be sorcerers, for example, or wizards. I think the word wizard will be more appropriate than sorcerer. Okay, wizard. Think of Merlin, for example. The wizard. He was an alchemist. In other words, he was. He had a lab, and according to legend, he was in search of potions, brews that will stop aging or make people live longer or heal, disease, etc. By understanding chemical compounds from plants, from trees, etc., brewing them and making potions to cure, illness. or again, to live longer, or even to live forever. That's pretty much one of the quests of chemistry today is produce medicine, pharmaceutical drugs, etc., pills to cure people or to alleviate symptoms, etc. Again, still with us. Again, the same principle. It's just a different approach, if you will, than the alchemist. Chemists are not called wizards, but they're kind of, because they're in labs and they're kind of like, coming up with potions, etc., very mysterious and so on. It's kind of like that. Okay, so it is really in the 1800s that the alchemists, many of them actually became chemists, and they started a new branch of science called chemistry. And this is the branch of scientists that look into the particles of matter, okay, what we call chemicals and molecules. In other words, what are the building blocks, okay, of matter and creation? The particles, the little bricks that make up matter. How are they put together? What are the chemical compounds, the molecules of of a bark of tree or a leaf or the skin of a human being, you name it. Okay, and in the 1870s, the chemists had arrived to the discovery of certain of those elements of nature. In their search for the elements of nature, they have pretty much mapped out a series of elements, which they actually presented in a table, in the elemental table in 1870. We're going to see the very first elemental table, again presented in 1870, that told us the elements that were known back then. More elements have been discovered, of course, today. Okay, so the search continues. Chemists are still trying to understand, all of the particles, the elemental particles of the universe, the chemical structures, the substances, and how are they compounded, to pretty much create what today we see as matter, in other words. Okay, the chemical compounds of water, for example, or oxygen, and so on, all of that. So one of the things, again, it's fascinating, that chemists discovered is that many of those chemical compounds, that matter is composed of, are minerals, mineral compounds, for example, like sodium, etc., magnesium, and so on. And what they realize is that when you look at those compounds under a microscope, which again, this is another thing, there's already a microscope. There is, of course, a light bulb put under the microscope so people can actually see what is really very clearly under the microscope. What they realize is that many of those chemical compounds have geometrical shapes, okay? Geometrical shapes that appear like cubes, in other words, cubes. That matter contains a lot of minerals, again, in which those minerals, when you look at those compounds of the minerals, they look like geometrical shapes, that everything was geometrical. Okay, so under a microscope, looking at, through the eyes of a chemist, everything looks like geometry, at a microscopic level, that is to say, at the level of the particles of creation, those little tiny bricks that make up matter. Okay, so this is going to influence the way people are going to start looking at reality as well. Whenever science discovers something about reality, and that discovery is taught to people in schools, for example, and children are educated under those ideas, when they're going to grow up, they're going to be influenced, by those ideas one way or another. So this revelation that everything was geometry, okay, influenced the way people in Europe and in the United States began to look at the world, particularly looking at the world as geometry. Okay, and this was manifested again in the world of art. The artist back in the late 19th century, early 20th century, created a whole new artistic movement that was the dominant movement of Europe and North America. It was called Cubism. Okay, Cubism. The artists were painting, you know, nature. They were painting landscapes. They were painting people, and so on, not as they appear to our eyes in the common, you know, in a common perception. Again, but rather through the eyes of chemistry. In other words, chemistry in art, through the eyes of, you know, chemists. Now they began to really portray, you know, reality in geometrically, okay? Because they said that's really real. Okay, we are geometry. You know, when we see a person, we see the outer shell, in other words, of the person, but that's just the superficial level of reality. Because when we look deeper into that person and what the person is made up of, you know, the skin and the bones and everything else, is just compounds that look very geometrical. And for the Cubists, they said, that for me, they said, is more real. In other words, you know, this is more real than simply, you know, trying to just, you know, paint people, you know, like a photograph, in other words, would, in the superficial sense. You know, so again, this is what the Cubists were doing. You know, the face of a human being, you know, appeared like this, or a couple perhaps, you know, having a conversation in a bar, etc. Even the background of the wall, you know, behind, everything looks like this, in other words, okay? Geometrically, that is. So this is extremely important because, you know, science, you know, was really developing certain technologies, certain tools that were not just promising people to live better. For example, like chemistry was promising people medicine or pharmaceutical products or drugs or syrups, etc., to make people better. But it was also altering the way people, you know, perceive the world. Okay, it was altering the way people saw reality, and you know, this is one way it was altering people again in terms of, you know, a more geometrical, if you will, you know, perception of the world. All right, so let us then continue with, let me see. All right, we got some time here. All right. So another tool of modern life was modern medicine. Okay. Besides chemistry, with the advent, of course, of chemical products, pharmaceutical products, and so on, that were aimed, like the ancient alchemists will say, you know, to kind of, they were like to be potions and so on, to cure people and so on. We're going to see also the another tool of modern technology, modern science, and of course that is modern medicine. Okay, this is another tool, by the way. It's really a tool to help heal people, you know, solve the problem of sickness, disease, or when people get, you know, a wound, etc., or need some sort of procedure, etc. That this is going to be a very helpful tool to help people pretty much survive many of the calamities and afflictions that befell people in the past in terms of sickness, disease, or accidents, and so on. And modern medicine was going to come in and assist people live longer, in other words, survive that, you know, and be able to live in this world for much longer than in the past. People will die at very a young age in the past because, you know, there were no tools to help people actually live and survive accidents and the like. So modern medicine was born, you know, in the 19th century, based on the understanding, again, that the human body was just like the universe. It was a machine. In other words, modern medicine started from that point forward. You know, they said, well, if the universe is a machine and is material, and what we're doing here is simply discovering how this machine works, the laws of nature, by making observations, again, delving into the world of nature to document, make observations and document how it works and gather facts, they said, well, the human body is no different. The human body is just like a machine, okay? And we're here to discover how it works. And so we have to look inside, we have to dissect people and be able to know what's inside, what are the main organs and how they're connected, and so on. What is the mechanism that maintains this body alive, and what are the mechanisms that end the life as well, okay? And so, again, there's a lot of dissection taking place in the 19th century. By the way, people are dissecting bodies and all that. So in those research, of course, we're going to see that certain scientists are going to make some breakthroughs in terms of, for example, what was one of the mechanisms that really affected people for the most part in terms of epidemic disease, for example. This is something that was still kind of a mystery. Epidemic disease has been around for thousands of years. It was one of the main sources of death for a lot of people, around the world. It was still very mysterious. Yes, people suggested that there were some form of contagions, if you will. Nobody really understood what contagion exactly was, but you get, near somebody that is sick, you're going to get sick, in other words. So it was Louis Pasteur that that breakthrough, the French biologist, in terms of understanding, for example, the immune system. Okay, the immune system on one hand, and how the immune system is the one that combats, things like microbes and germs, for example. Okay, yeah, this is the mechanism, again, that produces what is called epidemic disease, that in the environment there exist, of course, microorganisms. Those are very microscopic organisms, bacteria, viruses, and so on, that are the ones responsible to produce what is called disease, epidemic disease, again, in the human body, to make it sick and eventually some people, of course, die, others survive, of course, the disease. And so again, he's the one that after, when he's actually studying the blood, of course, contains, white blood cells that are considered to be, of course, the agents that combat, if you will. This is like the immune system. They kind of combat, of course, viruses and bacteria. They're the ones that fight off, or they're the ones that combat in many cases. That's part of the immune system, again, that we have an inbuilt system that is designed to combat, in other words, those microorganisms when we are confronted with them. And so, one of the things that he suggested is that, look, when a person is exposed to those microorganisms, the body is trying to build antibodies, in other words, to fight off and protect ourselves from those organisms. And that's how some people are able to actually survive those episodes of epidemic disease, is because their immune system was strong enough to fight off, again, the viruses, for example, that we're often confronted with in the environment. So after somebody gets sick and survives, that person, it builds immunity because it builds antibodies, in other words. So what he did is like, well, why don't we just inject a person, with just a small portion of a virus, not to actually, kill the person, but for the person to simply go through some form of battle, the immune system, and in that battle against this virus, that person is going to build up, of course, antibodies, and you immunize, in other words, that individual, okay, to build immunity. So again, the invention of vaccines, for example, by Louis Pasteur. And again, the promise is, well, with that, we're simply going to increase the lifespan of individuals and so on. So instead of people dying early age and so on, they can live longer. Okay, vaccination. And of course, drugs, of course, as well, cure-all potions. We're going to see, of course, we just talked about pharmaceuticals a moment ago. There's also going to be a lot of biologists and chemists and doctors that are going to be creating their own medicine at home based from herbs, etc. And they're going to actually advertise them and sell them, in stores. It was so common in the late 19th century to see at the supermarket a lot of potions, cure-all potions, that this is going to heal you from migraines, from stomach problems, from constipation, etc. All of that, and many of them actually had alcohol. So a lot of people actually drank those potions just for the alcohol. By the way, for the alcohol content. By the way, we are also going to see the advent of psychology and psychiatry. This is mental health, another tool how to actually treat people so they can, stabilize their behavior, their mind, if you will. And again, the field of modern psychology and psychiatry were born, that discarded, the influence of demons, that instead of attributing mental behavior or disturbances in behavior in the mind, to demons and spirits, that instead of looking at instead they were looking at simply at mental disorders produced by the brain. So they said, well, the brain is like the organ that is responsible for the mind. So if something's wrong with the mind, something must be wrong with the brain. If there's a mental disorder, there's a certain brain disorder, of course. So this is the approach, again, of modern psychiatry, that everything is seen as some form of brain, imbalance, in other words, hormones or etc. And that there is, of course, supernatural forces, or that there's, demons or, affecting people, etc. This is what modern science says, of course. And instead of sending people to the priest, to the church for exorcisms, and now people suffering from severe mental disorders are going to be sent to what is called a mental asylum. Okay, a mental asylum is simply a mental institution where people are going to be confined and being given some form of treatment there of various sorts. By the way, back then people felt that electricity was the cure-all for everything. So in many cases, people went, were given electroshocks, in the mental asylums just to see if they came to their senses. That was the idea, that they were out of their minds or they were out of their senses, and they wanted to bring them again to their senses, through electric shocks. And so that's another thing. So at any rate, again, those are really the overall the tools of modern technology, many of which exist today in a more sophisticated form, by the way. But those tools were born back in the late 19th century. Electricity, of course, with the light bulb, electrical motors. We're talking about modern communication systems, the telegraph, the telephone, transportation systems as well. They have been, of course, revolutionized in the 20th century. We're going to get there eventually in the 20th century. And, of course, chemistry and also modern medicine. Okay, so that is the first key term, the scientific and technological revolution. It was very extensive, the presentation, because it really deals with how a new science was introduced that replaced the old science, and how this science began to, after scientists began to gather knowledge from the material world, in terms of the elements, the forces, and so on, they began to use this knowledge to create new tools. All of the technologies were just described. So it's important to see that again as part of this progress that Americans were experiencing, the progress of science, the progress of technology. There were revolutions taking place in those fields, and people consider them to be extremely important, that this is something that we must advance, we must invest energies and monies, because this is going to create the kind of world that is going to empower people, solve many of the problems of humanity, etc., etc. Okay. Now, in part two, what we're going to be doing again is just looking at what is called economic progress. This is another area that also uh, Americans experienced in the 19th century, particularly the late 19th century, and also gave Americans the sense that this is yet another area, just like science and technology, were areas where progress had to be made at all costs to create a better future. This is another area that Americans witnessed that was also important to attain progress. Progress in the economy, in other words. Okay? We need to build up an economic system that allows people the opportunity to progress. And that is, again, the rise of capitalism. This is what Americans were experiencing during this time that convinced them that progress was possible, in other words, in terms of economics, of course, that it was possible to create a better economic, conditions for individuals or for families. That was important to create a better economic standing and well-being. That this was essential for experiencing not only the security of having everything met, but also to be happy as well. That if you have everything covered and if you're well off, you're gonna be happy. In other words, you're gonna experience, happiness. Human happiness is based on, again, economic progress. Okay, so I mentioned in the very first session that the rise of capitalism, of course, took place in the 1700s. And it was not until the 1800s when the system was really becoming mainstream in certain regions of Europe, like England, Holland, France, Germany, and also in, of course, the United States. In the late 19th century, we're going to see what historians call the prominence of capitalism in the U.S. Of course, it was becoming the main economic system of the U.S. That was allowing, of course, the transformation of American society in ways that the United States will actually become one of the leading capitalist societies in the world, of course, once we get into the 20th century. So I'm not going to repeat everything again of the introduction per se, just kind of recapture, bring to your attention again how this system came about, okay? Particularly in England, this is the home, again, of capitalism, the original home from which this system flourished and it started expanding in the countries I just mentioned. Okay, and it did so in the 1700s with the rise of the Industrial Revolution. Again, England was also the home of the very first Industrial Revolution in history. It was the first nation to industrialize, that is to say. Okay, so it really brought forth, a new system called industrial capitalism in the 1700s that was considered to be not only a new system, but it was really an economic revolution that really ousted, it displaced the old economic order, again, of the past. It's called feudalism. Under feudalism, again, economic progress was very difficult because all of the land and resources were owned by just a handful of people, like the monarch, the nobility, and the church. So it was very difficult for people to build wealth, because after all, even if you did, that wealth could be seized by the king, at will, if the king wanted, in other words, because the idea of private property was really literally non-existent. So it couldn't be done, in other words, not at a grand scale that, large numbers of people can simply just open up business and flourish, and build enterprises. So I mentioned that feudalism was actually discarded. It was overthrown, in a war, and in England, the English Civil War, in which the merchants the merchant class in England pretty much waged war against the king, that refused to grant, certain reforms, regarding, for example, the protection of private property. Merchants wanted their property to be theirs, and the king refused, and of course there was a war. The kings, the monarchs of England actually end up losing that war, and by the 1700s, the merchants are already in control of the English state, of course, and with that, the English merchants in control of the British Parliament introduced reforms in the Constitution of England to allow people to own property, private property, that is to say, okay, private ownership of resources or property. That allowed for some individuals to actually create enterprises, the idea of free enterprise. That's another key idea of capitalism. Capitalism brought private property, okay, and free enterprise. Very important, free enterprise. The idea that, look, you have to free people, to pursue their own self-interest and allow them to own property and allow them to open up a business. Whatever the business they want to open, of course, as long as, of course, it's within the law. You can open up any business, a shop, etc. Okay? So with this, again, in England, what we're going to see is that a great many investors and merchants began to open up factories or industries, in other words. This is going to become the most important enterprise in the 1700s and 1800s in England. Again, industries or factories, again, in which this factory is going to be the one producing all of the products for England. Everything that people required is going to be produced in factories now. Again, the most important enterprise, of course. Okay, so capitalism, of course, came into being during a time when industries were flourishing, they were propping up, and people who did not have money to create enterprises had the opportunity to earn their living by earning wages. This is another key feature, again, of capitalism as well. Okay, so capitalism not only brought private property and free enterprise, it also brought the idea of wage labor. And that, well, if you don't have any capital to open up a shop or a business, there's an opportunity for you to build wealth, in other words. And that is, selling your labor, okay, for a wage. It's called wage labor. You can work in any of the enterprises that are flourishing. You can be hired there permanently, and you can be paid a wage, in other words. It's called wage labor. You can earn your living by the payment of wages as well. This is another key concept of capitalism as well, okay? The central pillars, again, of capitalism: private property, free enterprise, and wage labor as well. Okay, so what capitalism did in England and all of the countries that adopted capitalism, like the United States, what it did is that it allowed people to actually move in up and down in what is called an economic ladder. Okay, that you're not going to be forced to live in the economic conditions of your parents that you were born into. In other words, that you can be born into any kind of circumstance, and you have the opportunity to move either up and down the ladder. Okay, you can increase your economic standing, you can have success, you can have more money if you work hard and so on, or you can go down as well. That's also the possibility. It's called social mobility. Social mobility is that under capitalism, people are moving up and down in what is called an economic ladder. In other words, and what that created is, again, a system of social classes. We're going to see the creation in capitalism of different classes. One is going to be, of course, the working class. Those are the laborers. Those are the ones that are, working in the factories and the industries and the mines and so on, doing physical labor. Okay, they earn wages, but they are the ones that are pretty much, if you will, at the bottom. Then you got a middle class, as well. Okay, we're going to see the creation of a middle class. It's not just that we're going to see a working class, but also a middle class. There are going to be people that are going to own their own little business or shops. Some of them are going to actually earn higher wages because they, graduated from college and university, and because they have skills, because they have knowledge. They are the ones that are hired, by industries and companies to do specialized work, like running the books. They're the managers, the supervisors, they're the accountants, the engineers, the chemists, and so on. So they earn more, and so they become, they rise the economic ladder just enough, and so they can become part of another class called the middle class. So there's mobility possible again in a capitalist system. There's different classes, if you will. Okay, so what this is going to do, of course, is that it is really establish a model. What England did, and later on the United States, when they adopted capitalism, okay, with the idea of legalizing or introducing private property, making it legal, protecting it as well, allowing people to open up business and enterprises of all kinds, and also bringing about also a wage labor economy, in which people are earning wages as well. What it did is that really established, what is called a model for economic development. That, look, this is how nations develop. You can build your national economy. This is what England and the US was actually saying to the rest of the world, is that, look, you can actually accomplish what we have accomplished in our society if you adopt capitalism. You can attain progress, in other words. If you want your society to progress, you have to adopt capitalism. So you have to allow people to own property, free enterprise, and of course, a wage labor system, and so on. And with that, you're going to have the kind of economic opportunities, that people are experiencing and enjoying, in England and the U.S. Of course, you're going to create a middle class. In other words, that's the goal. You create a middle class. All right. So what this is going to do is, we still have some minutes here. Okay, is that it really presented again to the rest of the world a path for economic development. You can develop your economy in this fashion, called capitalism. So in the 19th century, this economic system was not necessarily called economic system. It was not called capitalism. It was actually back in the 19th century. It was advertised as economic liberalism or laissez-faire. Okay. By the way, this is just like a footnote, if you will. Kind of if you go back, the 19th century, when in Great Britain or the United States or the leading capitalist societies were saying, look, this is how you develop your economy. And people understood that what they were talking about is a system that was known back in that day as economic liberalism or laissez-faire. Why? Well, because this is an economic system that kind of free people to pursue their self-interest. That's the liberalism part. To pursue their self-interest by ownership of property, having the opportunity to open up a business, for example, or searching employment. You have the opportunity to choose, again, from a multiplicity of sources where you want to work. Of course, you have to apply there and all that, but you're not forced to work only for a specific employer. You can actually, work for different employers and so on. It's called wage labor, free labor. You're free to work in different places. That's why it's called liberalism, economic liberalism. Okay, so what I want to actually delve into at this juncture is, look, what I just described about capitalism are pretty much the technical aspects of that. What is capitalism? Okay, so it's again a system that people own property, free enterprise and wage labor. Yes, it's true. But capitalism also brought something new to the world. Okay, besides bringing those ideas that I just described, it also brought something new that really revolutionized the way people actually live. Okay, forever. Okay, so what capitalism also did is introduce the idea of what is called individualism. Okay, because under capitalism, the idea is that every individual is very different from one another. We all have different likes and dislikes. We have different desires because we're very different. And that we should pursue our own self-interest. What makes us happy, okay, differs from individual to individual. And so because we're individuals and because we're very different from one another, every individual simply must pursue their own self-interest and happiness, of course. Okay, so this is extremely important because this is the first time something like this is proposed in human history. Prior to the coming of capitalism, the idea is that look, people were part of communities, they were part of groups, and you have to make the group happy. In other words, the idea is that people didn't see themselves necessarily as separated from the group, as totally cut off, or like individuals that were just seeking their own desires or self-interest. You're trying to seek the interest of the group that you belong to, whether it was a family or a community. In other words, okay, and people were not that individualistic. That's what I'm trying to say, all over the globe. But with capitalism, again, this is going to change, because under capitalism, what is being said is that look, we're very different from one another, and we're individuals. Yes, we might be part of groups, communities, or families, etc. But after all, you have to pursue your own path. As an individual, you must choose for yourself what you want to do in life, where you want to work. You have to be happy. You the individual, that is to say. Okay, so economic progress and happiness depends on the individual, and only on the individual. So if you want to progress, it's up to you. If you want to wake up every day early in the morning and be disciplined, be committed, work very hard, it's up to you. If you want to study, it's up to you. So how much progress you attain in this world, according to capitalism, it is up to the individual. If the individual doesn't want to work and doesn't want to go to school, doesn't want to do anything, well, that is your doing. In other words, that's your making. Okay, that is your responsibility. Where in other words, your economic well-being is all on you. In other words, whether you're poor or middle class, etc., it's up to you. In other words, again, because we're all individuals. That is to say. Okay, so individuals have to be responsible, motivated, and so on, to pursue their own interests. And this is important, as I mentioned, because this is breaking away. This idea of individualism is breaking away from how people perceive themselves in the past, and people perceive themselves in the past as being part of communities. Okay, I belong to this community, and it's important for me to make the family survive. Okay, I'm part of this large group. This is my family, and we're all working hard. We all work together to make the family prosper. So we always put the family first, or we always put the community first before the interests of the individual. We all work together to make the community work, and so on. Again, we all contribute, to the well-being of the community, and so on. Again, so individuals had a kind of group identity, not an individual identity, but more like a group identity. Okay, so this is important, extremely important, because individuals, in many cases, had to abide by the rules and the traditions of the group and the community. For example, what kind of work you're going to do in life? Well, in many cases, that was chosen for you by your parents. Your parents will tell you before capitalism, what you were going to do. Like, okay, there's several siblings. One is going to be in the kitchen, The youngest sibling is going to be in the kitchen. The other one is going to go with the father farming. Another one is going to go with the uncle to actually learn a trade, and so on. And so that was your path. You have to learn the trade of your parents, follow up again their advice, and so on. Even getting married, if you needed to get married, it was chosen for you or your mate. It was just called arranged marriages. That was actually something you have no choice, because this will benefit the family. If you marry this individual, again, the family is going to prosper. So you have to do this for the family, in other words. Okay, so under capitalism, all of that is discarded, because what capitalism said is like, look, we're individuals. We should follow our own self-interest. Whatever you want to do in life, you should just do it. Yeah, your parents are going to have a say in that, but look, just follow your own, your own path. Marry who you want, not what your parents are telling you, because this is your own happiness. In other words, it's about you. In other words, not the group. Okay, so capitalism again is a very individualistic. Once again, very individualistic. Ideology. That organizes society in a way that it really sees human beings as individuals and not groups. Okay. The other, of course, idea that capitalism brought, it was like I just said again, is the idea of private property or free enterprise. The idea that the central purpose of being alive here for human beings is to create wealth. Okay, to create wealth. That every individual must pursue, the path of wealth creation. In other words, so the ideal for anybody living in a capitalist society is to be your own boss, to have your own business, open up your own business. In other words, okay, that is the ideal. That's the goal. You reach the climax again of the social ladder when you have created your own wealth by means of having your own business. In other words, that's another thing. And as I mentioned, another very important contribution of capitalism is again the idea of creating a middle class. In other words, look, what capitalism suggests is that the end goal, why capitalism insists that this is the best of all possible systems, is because in due course, when a nation establishes, capitalism as the main economic system of that country, is that the country is going to provide the means by which individuals are going to rise up the economic ladder and become part of the middle class. And the idea of capitalism is that most people are going to become members of the middle class. Okay, but it goes beyond that. It's not just to become part of the middle class for the sake of it, but rather for the people that are already part of the middle class to enjoy this world through the consumption of goods and services. In other words, that the middle class, again, is that class of people that are truly living a kind of paradise on earth. Not only because they're well off, but because they have the means, they have the monies to enjoy themselves by purchasing products. Everything that they desire, they can buy it. And so by purchasing everything that they want, they're going to attain fulfillment and happiness in the end. Okay? Again, so this is going to lead to, of course, the rise of a consumer culture in the United States. And capitalist societies, of course, are also very prone to consumption, to consumerism. The middle class is the one that actually participates, again, in this, consumption or consumerism. So again, economic progress, again, was perceived in the 19th century as a state in which, if you attain economic progress in this lifetime, it's almost like you're living heaven on earth. Okay, in other words, economic progress is how people become happy. Okay, this is how we find fulfillment, enjoyment again in this world. It's almost like being in heaven. Every need is met. We minimize suffering. There's all sorts of comforts, and instead of suffering from lacks and wants, economic progress brings that sense again of divine fulfillment, in other words. Okay. Now, last but not least, as we close part two, I just want to just mention that capitalism is not going to be the only economic system that is going to offer that paradise on earth. Okay. This ideal existence, people are going to be happy. There's going to be competing visions of economic progress. Capitalism will find competition by alternative, philosophies that are on the rise. In the late 19th century in Europe, there are European systems that are on the rise, like socialism, for example. Okay, socialism is going to be an alternative path that challenge, in many cases, the this utopian vision, this paradise vision of capitalism. In other words, socialism pretty much was proposed in Europe by a series of philosophers and the like. That what they're suggesting here, what they're contending or arguing, is that under capitalism, again, a lot of people cannot really compete, again, with each other, with the rest of other individuals, because many people just can't do it. Because what about the elderly, for example? What about the elderly? What about if they cannot work? They don't have the energy. What about people who suffer accidents, for example, and cannot work, for example? They suffer from injuries and the like, so they cannot really work. What about them? What about orphans? Children, for example, that are orphaned, they're in the streets and so on. What about people that are unemployed? That cannot find employment. What about those people? So what the socialism indicates is that capitalism really leaves out a lot of people, from actually achieving that dream. In other words, so what socialism actually, proposes is that the state will have to intervene instead in order to distribute some wealth. In other words, in order to create what is called social programs. In other words, okay, to allow for those people that do not have the means, that suffer, that are very old and so on, to allow those people to actually live in this world. Okay, in other words, welfare. In other words, social programs, assistance for the elderly, for orphans, for single mothers, and so on, or that the state can actually create employment when their people are fired, by industries, that the state can hire them, so they can earn wages to do something. In other words, so that's what socialism is. It's some state intervention in the economy. And of course, there's going to be another system that challenged capitalism called communism. That is also going to propose an alternative, paradise, an alternative vision, again, of the future for economic progress. And the communism, of course, is also coming from Europe, by the way, in which under communism, the ideal society is one in which there's no social classes whatsoever. Okay, in other words, look, nobody owns more than others. In other words, okay, so the communists have that kind of vision, again, of progress, is that for people to be truly happy is when people don't own anything. Okay, there's no ownership of anything, so there's no accumulation of wealth, so there's no social classes of poor, middle class, upper class, etc. Okay, so those are going to be competing, again, ideologies that once we move into the 20th century, they're going to be competing in the world stage. The world is going to be pretty much divided ideologically, and there's going to be the ideologies that are competing: capitalism, socialism, communism, to shape the future of humanity. In other words, if we are to create heaven on earth, what is the ideal economic system that is going to get us there? In other words, to create this perfect world. Okay? So again, when we come back, we're just going to now look into the theory of evolution and how the theory of evolution is going to influence the thinking of the United States, of course, Americans in the late 19th century. This is all I have for you, and I'll see you then in session 3 when we come back. Right? Thank you.